Hi, so this video covers the nature and character of intra-industry trade because I believe we haven't touched this issue yet, and provides a short summary on the theories explaining direction and volume of international trade. Okay, so when it comes to international trade, we distinguish between inter-industry and intra-industry trade. So inter-industry trade is all about exchange of heterogeneous goods produced by different industries. So this can be wine and clothes, capital intensive and labor intensive goods, and so on and so forth. So probably it's kind of intuitive that when we discuss inter-industry trade, this is related rather to the theory of comparative advantage and Heckscher-Ohlin theory, because in these models, there is simply no reason for international exchange of the relatively similar goods. These models are able to explain only direction and volume of different goods. In contrast, when we analyze intra-industry trade, we talk about exchange of homogeneous goods produced by the same industry. So for instance, international exchange of cars of different brands, because there is still flow of cars from Japan to United States and from United States to Japan, clothes of different brands, and so on and so forth. So obviously, again, as I said, there is no place for intra-industry trade under conventional theories of international trade. It can be only explained by new trade theory. Because as you remember, two fundamental assumptions of new trade theory are monopolistic competition, which in turn arises from love of variety, which is the second assumption. So consumers enjoy the fact that they can choose out of a variety of goods, like as I said, cars of different brands and so on and so forth. And this is why we have relatively big number of firms producing relatively similar goods, which is called monopolistic competition. Yet not perfectly homogeneous, because of differentiation, because consumers love variety and they derive some utility from the fact they can purchase from different firms, which produce just slightly different goods. Okay, so when it comes to measurement of international intra-industry trade, it's calculated in the following way. So when it comes to industry I, like let's say automotive industry, first you need to calculate total volume of international trade of goods produced by this industry, so add exports to imports. You have to subtract the absolute value of difference between exports and imports, divide by the total volume of exports and imports, and multiply by 100. I know, it sounds kind of complicated, but nevertheless, this is how you calculate intra-industry trade volume for particular industry. And when you want to compute the total indicator for intra-industry trade volume for two countries A and B, you calculate it as the weighted sum of all the industries, where this component is the share of industry I in the total international trade of within all the industries. Okay, sounds complicated, and this is kind of complicated. That's why it's really hard to find any statistical data on intra-industry trade. So what I managed to find is data provided by OECD. They are kind of obsolete because they cover the period of 1997 till 2008. But let's deal with what we have. Okay, so actually it's kind of interesting that the indicator, like the share of intra-industry trade in the total trade in manufactured goods, is definitely higher for more developed countries, characterized by the higher level of economic integration. For instance, take Belgium. Belgium had this indicator equal to approximately 90%, and this means that 90% of international trade of Belgium is intra-industry trade. So Belgium produces almost all the goods produced domestically. It exports these goods and it imports the same kinds of goods. Then we have France, very similar, Austria, Netherlands, United Kingdom, Spain, Hungary, Czech Republic, kind of surprising, Slovak Republic, Germany. Again, these data are kind of obsolete, so I'm pretty sure that nowadays Germany has a higher indicator when it comes to intra-industry trade. Poland, Italy, Portugal, Australia, New Zealand, Iceland, and so on and so forth. So again, there is no straightforward relationship, which states that, let's say, level of economic development determines the volume of intra-industry trade. But again, it kind of does because when it comes to Ricardian model, as we discussed during, I think, like the second workshop or something like this, Ricardian model explains relatively well the volume of international trade between developed and developing countries, because they indeed have very different technologies, different shape of production possibilities frontier respectively, and in this case they indeed have different opportunity costs, which result in comparative advantage. But again, which is kind of beneficial and advantageous under the framework of Ricardian model, is not that advantageous when you think about other real-life issues. Okay, I will explain myself. So, obviously, relatively underdeveloped countries benefit from international trade with developed countries. Opportunity cost of producing one computer is definitely higher in Argentina than in the United States. On the other hand, for developing countries, developing and emerging countries, let's say relatively underdeveloped countries, this kind of international trade results in the lack of economic diversification. So right now, by specializing in producing more agricultural goods, they indeed can afford consuming more computers and manufactured goods in general. However, in the long run, the lack of economic diversification and concentration on producing primary commodities is not that beneficial. So that's why when it comes to developing countries, they usually have a much lower share of intra-industry trade in comparison to developed countries. So, there is some kind of link, but it's not straightforward, it's not uniform, but still it provides kind of intuition behind new trade theory and intra-industry trade, and the application of new trade theory and conventional theories of international trade for the countries of different characteristics. Okay, so this is a bit different. This is a graph describing average annual change in intra-industry trade, and it covers the period of 2001 till 2008. Again, I do not know whether it's pretty illustrative for you, but I think the case of Russian Federation and Chile are kind of interesting because it indicates that the share of intra-industry trade decreased in this country significantly. So actually it can be the indicator of different pattern of international trade and also decrease in the degree of economic diversification. So now instead of importing and exporting manufactured goods and primary commodities, In this period, those countries concentrated mainly on production of primary commodities. So in this period, the share of primary commodities in the exports of these countries increased. So again, this just to provide you some general idea about intra-industry trade, its determinants and implications. Okay, so once we are done with this, before proceeding to the topic of economic integration, I just like to, summarize a bit theories of international trade, except the gravity model, because, this one is rather empirical than theoretical. So let's start with assumptions. So as you remember, when it comes to the theory of comparative advantage and Hackshaw-Ohlin theory, we stick to the famous Ricardian simplifications as they are identified by Krugman. So we assume constant returns to scale, and as you remember, it means that per unit cost of production does not depend on the volume of production, and perfect competition. And perfect competition kind of arises from constant returns to scale, because under constant returns to scale, there are no incentives for, concentration, for industry concentration. So producing higher level of output does not imply any advantages or disadvantages. So that's why on industry there is a big number of perfectly homogeneous firms. And also we assume different technologies and different relative factor abundance, because in these models those differences serve as the main source of international trade. No international trade can be possible without, again, difference in technologies and difference in relative factor abundance. So in contrast, under new trade theory, we assumed increasing returns to scale or economies of scale, monopolistic competition, and homogeneous technologies and preferences. So we assume that two countries are of the same income, of the same level of development, same production structure, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to international mobility, the crucial assumption under theory of comparative advantage and Hackshaw-Ohlin theory were immobility of labor and capital. Because in this case, otherwise international trade makes no sense. So international trade was treated as the kind of indirect exchange of these factors. And in contrast, again, under new trade theory, we assumed perfect mobility of manufacturing labor force. So workers employed in manufacturing sector are perfectly mobile. They can move from one region to another, and firms can also reallocate to different regions. When it comes to the rationale behind international trade, if I'm allowed to define anything like this, under theory of comparative advantage and Hackshaw-Ohlin theory, specialization according to comparative advantage, regardless of its nature, like whether it arises from the difference in technologies or difference in factor abundance, increases overall international production. So Ricardian model did not really concentrate on the implications of international trade for different groups of stakeholders. We just underlined that total international production increased. Under Hackshaw-Ohlin theory, it was a bit different. So this model implies that international trade can put some groups of stakeholders in the relative disadvantage. But nevertheless, overall increase in the volume of production and consumption was treated as the main rationale behind international trade under theory of comparative advantage and Hackshaw-Ohlin theory. In contrast, under new trade theory, openness to international trade works in the same way as increase in the stock of labor. So in this case, production increases and variety increases. And because we assume increasing returns to scale, average cost of production decreases as well. So when it comes to the direction and type of international trade, the theory of comparative advantage and Heckscher-Ohlin theory can perfectly predict the direction of international trade. So the countries export goods which can be produced domestically at the lower opportunity costs and import goods associated with higher opportunity costs. And obviously in this case we discuss inter-industry trade exclusively because, as I mentioned before, there is simply no place for intra-industry trade. In contrast, under new trade theory, direction of international trade is now predefined. So the countries export and import relatively similar goods produced within the same industry, which is called intra-industry trade, as we discussed before. And in this case, it's simply impossible to predict the direction of trade. Like, it's impossible to say that this country will export this good and import this good. No, like the country will export and import good of the same type. Okay, when it comes to income and prices, under Ricardian theory, international prices it used to be price. International prices take the value between autarky prices. So yes, indeed, we have some kind of equalization. So clothes used to be more expensive in Portugal than in England. Now clothes will become cheaper in Portugal. I mean, for Portuguese consumers, and vice versa. When it comes to Heckscher-Ohlin theory, we have price equalization, and in addition, we also have factor prices equalization. So, I mean, in labor-abundant countries, wages will increase in comparison to autarky state, and in capital-abundant countries, rent will increase in comparison to autarky state. In contrast, under new trade theory, instead of equalization, we expect divergence. So, as we discussed last time, effective prices are lower in the regions with higher stock of labor. And firms will tend to reallocate to the regions with the higher stock of labor. Again, you can check the formal proof in the previous video. I will not get back to this right now. But, definitely this is enough to know in order to pass the final exam. So as a result, as we discussed, if there is initial regional discrepancy, so we have regions like more developed regions attracting more labor and more firms, this gap will increase. So as a result, we deal with the kind of core periphery implications when firms and workers will reallocate to the regions where the stock of labor and the number of firms is already big, because relatively developed regions are characterized with lower prices. And so basically this is enough. But intuitively you can also think about other opportunities. Like in bigger regions, firms can benefit from external economies of scale. When a bigger size of the industry implies lower production costs for all the firms constituting this industry. There are definitely more opportunities for labor, easier access to education, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of factors to think about, even outside the formal model boundaries. So finally, when it comes to determinants of international trade, if theory of comparative advantage and Heckscher-Ohlin theories are correct, then we expect income gap to cause positive effect on international trade. So the same will apply to the difference in technologies and difference in production costs. Because again, it can be a kind of a simplification, but if it helps you to understand this model a bit, the idea is like this. Heterogeneity with respect to production structure, technologies, income, and so on and so forth. serves as the main source of international trade. So under conventional theories of international trade, dissimilar countries will trade more in comparison to similar countries. So for instance, as we discussed in case of Ricardian model, like Belgium and France have very similar tastes, technologies, production structure, production costs, and so on and so forth. So in this case, Ricardian model is simply unable to explain relatively big volume of international trade between Belgium and France. In contrast, under new trade theory, it's exactly the opposite. So we expect that countries of the similar level of income, similar type, character, whatever, of technologies, production structure, consumer preferences, and so on and so forth, will trade more in comparison to the similar countries. So actually, if you're interested and you would like to do something about it, I don't know, like project or thesis or whatsoever, in econometric analysis, like let's say positive sign of GDP per capita distance will indicate that two countries trade according to comparative advantage. In contrast, negative sign will indicate that difference in income causes a devastating effect on international trade, and this will imply new trade theory pattern of international trade. Okay, nevertheless, I believe you've got the idea. Just a final point, like as I said before, when we talk about theory of comparative advantage and Heckscher-Ohlin theory, those models usually have empirical validity when we analyze countries of the different level of economic development, like United States and Mexico, Poland and Germany, and so on and so forth. In contrast, under new trade theory, we can successfully explain international trade between, countries of the same level of development. Okay, I'm just talking about this because you have a very similar question on your final exam, and that's why I'd like to concentrate on this a bit. Okay, so that was it. Next time we discuss economic integration and its implications, and thank you for watching.